In the fading light of Greece's golden age, there was a land that most people barely noticed. It sat north of the famous city-states, rugged and wild, a place the proud Southerners sometimes called barbarian. And yet, from those hills and muddy roads, a new kind of power quietly gathered breath. It did not arrive with trumpets. It arrived with discipline, vision, and a hunger to prove the world wrong. Imagine a young prince watching the old order crack. He sees Athens and Sparta arguing over honor and memory, while his own homeland struggles just to stay united. The boy grows up learning that respect is not given. It is built. He understands that if Macedonia is to survive, it must become something different, something stronger, something no one expects. That prince becomes Philip, a king who does not chase glory for its own sake, but who studies, listens, and learns. He once lived as a hostage in Thebes, far from home, and instead of cursing his fate, he treated it like a classroom. He watched the Theban generals refine their phalanx. He traced their formations in the dirt, and he wondered how to make them better. Years later, when he finally holds the reins of his own kingdom, he begins to forge a new kind of army, not just with iron and wood, but with ideas. Meanwhile, somewhere in the palace courtyards, a boy listens to the world at night. He is named Alexander. He hears the clatter of spears, the murmur of plans, and the early footsteps of destiny. He is curious, restless, and brave in a way that sometimes frightens the people who love him. He asks questions that reach beyond the horizon. He tames a wild horse that no one else can ride, not through force, but by understanding the animal's fear of its own shadow. The horse is named Bucephalus. People remember that moment because it feels like a promise. One day, this boy will ride farther than anyone dreams. But this story is not a sprint. It is a steady climb. Philip begins by stitching together a kingdom that has been torn by rivalries. He speaks to nobles who do not trust one another and convinces them to trust him. He pays his soldiers not with empty promises, but with steady coin, so that they can train year-round and sharpen their skills. He arms his infantry with long spears that reach the enemy first, and trains them to move like a single living thing. He pairs them with swift cavalry who strike where the line bends. He does not shout about revolution. He builds it piece by piece until even his enemies can feel the ground shifting beneath them. What makes this moment so powerful is not only the battles to come, but the relationship at its core. A father who sees war as a science, and a son who sees the world as a stage for courage and wonder. Philip prepares the instrument. Alexander learns its music. Together, even before they share the same battlefield, they are already changing how power works. And then the question that once seemed ridiculous begins to feel real. How does a place once ignored become the center of everything? The answer is not a single victory. It is 1,000 choices, made with patience and nerve. It is the weight of a spear held steady by a farmer who was trained to stand shoulder to shoulder with his neighbor. It is the wisdom brought home from foreign roads and the determination to turn lessons into action. It is a father who refuses to accept the limits of his time and a son who refuses to accept the limits of his world. If stories like this spark your curiosity, and if you love tracing the threads that tie human lives to the rise and fall of empires, stay with us. Like this video, share it with someone who enjoys history told through people, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires. There is so much more ahead, and the journey is just beginning. Picture this. It's the middle of the 4th century before Christ, and if you were to look at a map of the Greek world, you'd see the mighty city-states of Athens and Sparta dominating the landscape. But there, tucked away in the mountainous north, was a kingdom that most Greeks barely considered civilized at all: Macedonia. The Macedonians spoke a dialect so different that many Greeks questioned whether they were truly Greek at all. To the sophisticated citizens of Athens, these northerners were little more than barbarians who happened to share some distant ancestry. They lived in a harsh mountainous land where survival depended more on cattle herding and farming than on the refined arts of philosophy and democracy that flourished in the south. But Macedonia's greatest weakness wasn't its reputation. It was its internal chaos. The kingdom was essentially a collection of feuding noble families, each controlling their own slice of territory, each convinced they deserved more power than their neighbors. These aristocrats, known as the companions, would switch sides as quickly as the mountain weather changed, making alliances and breaking them based on whatever served their immediate interests. The royal court itself was a dangerous place to be. Assassination plots were as common as morning meals, and succession disputes could tear the kingdom apart for years at a time. When a king died, it wasn't unusual for brothers to fight brothers, uncles to murder nephews, and entire branches of the royal family to disappear in the night. The throne of Macedonia wasn't just a seat of power. It was practically a death sentence. This instability made Macedonia incredibly vulnerable to its neighbors. The Illyrians to the west would raid Macedonian territory whenever they pleased, carrying off livestock and people as slaves. The Thracians to the east did the same, treating Macedonia like their personal hunting ground. Even more humiliating, the Greek city-states to the south would occasionally march north to teach the barbarians a lesson whenever it suited their political needs. The Macedonian army, if you could even call it that, was a joke by Greek standards. They had no unified training, no standardized equipment, and certainly no loyalty beyond their immediate clan leaders. When battle came, which it often did, Macedonian forces would scatter like leaves in a storm, each noble looking out for his own interests rather than fighting for any greater cause. But here's where the story gets truly fascinating. In the year 359 before Christ, when Macedonia seemed destined to fragment into irrelevance, a young man named Philip stepped forward to claim the throne. He was just 23 years old, but he carried with him something no previous Macedonian king had possessed, a secret weapon that would change everything. You see, Philip hadn't spent his youth lounging in the Macedonian court. Through a twist of fate that seemed like misfortune at the time, he had been sent as a hostage to the city of Thebes when he was just a teenager. Now, being a hostage might sound like a terrible fate, but for Philip, it became the most valuable education any future king could receive. In Thebes, Philip found himself in the company of one of the most brilliant military minds of the ancient world, a general named Epaminondas. This wasn't just any ordinary commander. Epaminondas had revolutionized Greek warfare by developing new tactics that had allowed tiny Thebes to defeat both Athens and Sparta, the two greatest powers of the Greek world. Day after day, young Philip watched and learned. He studied how Epaminondas organized his troops, how he coordinated different types of soldiers, and most importantly, how he used psychological warfare to break enemy morale before the actual fighting even began. Philip absorbed these lessons like a sponge, understanding that warfare wasn't just about individual courage or superior numbers, it was about system, strategy, and innovation. But perhaps the most important thing Philip learned in Thebes was patience. He watched how Epaminondas would spend months, sometimes years, preparing for a single campaign. The great general understood that true victory came not from rushing into battle, but from careful preparation, superior training, and knowing your enemy better than they knew themselves. When Philip finally returned to Macedonia to claim his birthright, he brought with him ideas that would have seemed impossible to his ancestors. He envisioned not just a unified Macedonia, but a professional army that could stand against any force in the known world. He dreamed of transforming his fractured kingdom into something that would make even the mighty Persians take notice. But first, he had to survive long enough to put his plans into action. The same noble families who had torn Macedonia apart for generations weren't about to quietly accept the authority of this young king, no matter what fancy ideas he had picked up during his time in the south. Philip would need every ounce of cunning, every lesson he had learned, and perhaps a bit of luck to forge his broken kingdom into something truly extraordinary. The stage was set for one of history's most remarkable transformations, the rise of a king who would not only unite Macedonia, but create the foundation for his son to conquer the known world. When Philip took control of Macedonia, he didn't just want to build a better army, He wanted to completely reimagine what an army could be. What he created was so revolutionary that it would influence military thinking for centuries to come. The first thing Philip realized was that Macedonia's traditional way of fighting was hopelessly outdated. Like most Greek armies, Macedonian forces relied on citizen soldiers who would show up when called, fight a battle or two, then return to their farms and shops. These men might be brave, but they lacked the training, discipline, and most importantly, the time needed to master complex military maneuvers. So Philip made a decision that shocked the Macedonian nobility. He would create the world's first truly professional army. Instead of relying on part-time farmers and craftsmen, he would recruit full-time soldiers and pay them year-round salaries. This meant his men could dedicate themselves entirely to the art of war, training together day after day until they moved like a single organism. But Philip's masterstroke wasn't just creating professional soldiers, it was the weapon he gave them. Traditional Greek spears were about 8 feet long, which worked fine for the close quarters fighting that dominated ancient battlefields. But Philip had a different vision. He commissioned his craftsmen to create something unprecedented, a spear that stretched nearly 20 feet from tip to base. This massive weapon, called the sarissa, was so long that it required both hands to wield effectively. When a Macedonian phalanx advanced, the first 5 rows of soldiers could point their sarissas forward simultaneously, creating an impenetrable wall of bronze spear points. Enemy soldiers found themselves trying to fight men they couldn't even reach, while multiple spear tips threatened them from different angles. The psychological effect was just as important as the tactical advantage. Imagine being an enemy soldier, watching this forest of spear points advancing toward you, knowing that you'd have to somehow get past 20 feet of sharp bronze just to swing your sword. Many enemies broke and ran before the fighting even began. But Philip understood something that most military commanders missed. No single weapon or tactic could win every battle. Different situations required different solutions, and the key was learning how to combine various elements into a coordinated whole. This is where his time in Thebes truly paid off. Philip had watched Epaminondas coordinate infantry, cavalry, and light troops in ways that maximized each unit's strengths while covering their weaknesses. Now Philip would take this concept even further. While his infantry formed the solid core of his army with their sarissas, Philip developed an elite cavalry unit that would become legendary, the companion cavalry. These weren't just mounted soldiers. They were the cream of Macedonian nobility, personally selected and trained by Philip himself. What made the companions special wasn't just their skill with horses and weapons, though both were exceptional. It was their role in Philip's revolutionary tactical system. While the phalanx would fix the enemy in place with their wall of spears, the companions would strike at the perfect moment, smashing into the enemy's flank or rear like a thunderbolt. Philip spent years perfecting this coordination. His infantry learned to advance in perfect formation, maintaining their spear wall even over rough terrain. His cavalry practiced charging at precisely the right moment, neither too early nor too late. Light troops learned to skirmish and retreat, drawing enemy forces out of position. But perhaps Philip's most innovative contribution to ancient warfare was his use of siege engines. Most Greek armies avoided fortified cities, preferring to fight in open fields where traditional tactics worked best. Philip saw this as a limitation he could turn into an advantage. He recruited engineers and craftsmen from across the known world, men who understood the principles of leverage, counterweight, and torsion. Under his patronage, they developed catapults that could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds, siege towers that could overtop the highest walls, and battering rams that could pound through gates that had stood for centuries. What made this truly revolutionary was how Philip integrated these siege engines into his overall military strategy. Instead of treating sieges as separate from field battles, he developed ways to use his infantry, cavalry, and siege engines together. His phalanx could protect the siege engines from enemy sallies, while his cavalry could cut off supply lines and reinforcements. The result was something the ancient world had never seen before, an army that could fight effectively in any situation. Open field battle? The phalanx and cavalry combination was nearly unstoppable. Siege warfare? Philip's engineers could crack any fortification. Mountain warfare? His light troops could outmaneuver any enemy. Naval support? Philip even developed ways to coordinate his land forces with allied fleets. Training this complex system required unprecedented dedication. Philip's soldiers didn't just learn to fight, they learned to think as part of a larger whole. A phalangite understood not just how to wield his sarissa, but when to advance, when to hold position, and how to respond to cavalry movements on the flanks. A companion cavalryman knew not just how to charge, but how to time his attack to support the infantry's advance. This level of coordination required something else that was revolutionary: standardized equipment and uniforms. Every soldier in a particular unit carried identical weapons, wore identical armor, and trained with identical techniques. This wasn't just about appearance. It was about ensuring that every man could work seamlessly with his neighbors, creating the kind of precision that would make Philip's tactical innovations possible. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It took Philip years to recruit the right men, develop the new weapons and tactics, and train his forces to the level of perfection he demanded. But when it all came together, the result was unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen: a military machine so advanced that it would remain virtually undefeated for generations. What Philip had created wasn't just a better army. It was an entirely new way of thinking about warfare itself. By the year 338 before Christ, Philip had transformed Macedonia from a fractured kingdom into a military powerhouse that made even the greatest Greek city-states nervous. But nervous wasn't enough for Philip. He wanted something far more ambitious. He wanted to unite all of Greece under Macedonian leadership, and he was willing to fight the most powerful coalition in Greek history to get it. The irony of the situation was almost poetic. Here was Philip, the former hostage who had once been dismissed as a barbarian prince, now threatening the very cities that had considered themselves the pinnacle of civilization. Athens, the birthplace of democracy and philosophy, and Thebes, the city where Philip had learned his most valuable lessons, had joined forces to stop their former prisoner from achieving his dreams. The alliance against Macedonia was impressive by any measure. Athens brought its legendary naval power and its tradition of producing brilliant orators and strategists. Thebes contributed the sacred band, 300 elite warriors who were considered nearly invincible in close combat. Dozens of smaller city-states added their forces, creating an army that outnumbered Philip's Macedonians and should have, by all traditional thinking, crushed them completely. But Philip had something his enemies didn't understand: a military system so advanced that it was like bringing modern weapons to an ancient battlefield. More importantly, he had spent years studying these very opponents, learning their strengths and weaknesses, understanding how they thought and fought. The two armies met at Cheronea, a small town in central Greece that would become one of history's most significant battlefields. On the morning of the battle, as the mist rose from the surrounding hills, both sides knew they were fighting for more than just territory or political influence. They were fighting for the future of Greek civilization itself. Philip's tactical genius revealed itself in how he positioned his forces. Instead of simply lining up his phalanx and charging forward, he created a complex battle plan that would use every element of his revolutionary military system. His sarissa-armed infantry would hold the center, but the real action would happen on the flanks, where his innovations could shine. On the right wing, Philip placed himself at the head of his most experienced troops. These were the veterans who had followed him through years of campaigns, men who understood his tactics so well they could anticipate his orders. But on the left wing, Philip made a decision that shocked even his own commanders. He gave command to his 18-year-old son, Alexander. This wasn't just nepotism or a father's indulgence. Philip recognized something special in his young son: a combination of tactical brilliance, personal courage, and natural leadership that reminded him of the great commanders he had studied in his youth. But more than that, Philip understood that this battle would likely decide the future of Macedonia, and Alexander needed to be part of that victory if he was ever going to command the loyalty of the army. Young Alexander had grown up watching his father transform Macedonia, listening to discussions of military strategy and training with the best warriors in the kingdom. But this was different. This was his first real test as a commander, leading experienced soldiers against some of the finest warriors Greece had ever produced. The battle began with Philip executing one of the most sophisticated tactical maneuvers of the ancient world. Instead of a straightforward charge, he ordered his right wing to conduct what appeared to be a retreat. The Athenians, thinking they had gained an advantage, pressed forward eagerly, breaking their formation as they pursued what they thought were fleeing Macedonians. This was exactly what Philip had hoped for. As the Athenian lines stretched and became disorganized, gaps began to appear in their formation. It was at this crucial moment that Alexander received his orders to attack. Leading the companion cavalry, the 18-year-old prince charged directly into the sacred band of Thebes, the elite unit that had never been defeated in battle. What happened next became the stuff of legend. Alexander didn't just fight, he led from the front, his presence inspiring his men to fight with a ferocity that surprised even the veteran Thebans. The coordination between father and son was perfect. While Philip's feigned retreat drew the Athenians out of position, Alexander's cavalry charge shattered the Theban line. The famous sacred band, which had dominated Greek battlefields for decades, was completely destroyed. Of their 300 elite warriors, not a single man survived the day. But the real masterstroke was yet to come. With the Thebans broken and the Athenians out of position, Philip signaled his right wing to stop retreating and counterattack. The Macedonian phalanx, with their long sarissas, suddenly turned and advanced with perfect discipline. The disorganized Athenians found themselves trapped between Philip's advancing spears and Alexander's circling cavalry. What followed wasn't just a military victory. It was a demonstration of how advanced Philip's tactical system had become. The combination of disciplined infantry, elite cavalry, and brilliant coordination had achieved something that seemed impossible: a complete victory over the combined forces of Athens and Thebes. The aftermath of Chaeronea changed the Greek world forever. Athens, which had dominated Greek politics for over a century, was forced to accept Macedonian supremacy. Thebes, which had briefly challenged both Athens and Sparta for leadership of Greece, was broken as a major power. Dozens of smaller city-states submitted to Philip's authority without further fighting. But perhaps the most important consequence of the battle was what it revealed about Alexander. In his first major command, the young prince had not only succeeded, but had shown the kind of tactical brilliance and personal courage that marked him as his father's true heir. The veterans who had followed Philip for years now looked at Alexander with new respect, understanding that Macedonia's future was in capable hands. Philip himself was said to have wept when he saw the bodies of the sacred band scattered across the battlefield. These were the same warriors whose tactics he had studied as a young hostage in Thebes, men whose courage and skill had once inspired him. There was no satisfaction in their destruction, only the recognition that an era had ended. The victory at Chaeronea made Philip the undisputed master of Greece, but it also set in motion events that would reshape the entire ancient world. With Greece united under his leadership, Philip began planning an even more ambitious project: the conquest of the Persian Empire. It was a dream that would ultimately fall to his son to fulfill, but the foundation for that incredible achievement was laid on the battlefield of Chaeronea, where an 18-year-old prince first proved himself worthy of his father's legacy. Are you fascinated by this ancient legacy? Then comment your thoughts, like the video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires for more epic journeys. The assassination of Philip II in 336 before Christ came at the worst possible moment for Macedonia. Philip had just finished uniting all of Greece under his leadership and was preparing for his greatest ambition yet, the conquest of the Persian Empire. His armies were already crossing into Asia Minor when news arrived that would shake the ancient world. The great king was dead, murdered by his own bodyguard during his daughter's wedding celebration. In that instant, everything Philip had built seemed ready to crumble. The Greek city-states that had reluctantly accepted Macedonian rule saw this as their chance for freedom. The Persian Empire, which had been preparing to defend against Philip's invasion, suddenly sensed weakness. Even within Macedonia itself, rival claimants to the throne began gathering supporters, believing that Philip's young son couldn't possibly hold together such a vast and fragile coalition. Alexander was only 20 years old when he inherited this crisis. Most people expected him to spend years just trying to maintain control of Macedonia, let alone continue his father's ambitious plans. After all, he was barely more than a boy, untested in the complex world of politics and diplomacy that had allowed Philip to build his empire. But those who thought this way didn't truly understand what Philip had created in his son. Alexander hadn't just inherited Philip's throne. He had inherited his revolutionary military system, his network of alliances, and most importantly, his vision of what Macedonia could become. More than that, Alexander possessed something that even his remarkable father had lacked, an almost supernatural confidence in his own destiny. The young king's first challenge came from within his own family. Philip's death had created a succession crisis, with various relatives and nobles questioning whether Alexander, despite being Philip's designated heir, was truly ready to rule. Some preferred his half-brother. Others supported distant cousins with stronger claims to legitimacy. Alexander's response was swift and decisive. Within weeks of his father's death, he had eliminated all potential rivals, securing his position through a combination of political maneuvering and, when necessary, force. But the real test came from the south, where the Greek city-states were already in open rebellion. Athens had declared its independence from Macedonian rule, Thebes was raising an army, and dozens of smaller cities were cutting their ties with Macedonia. The great coalition that Philip had spent decades building was falling apart before Alexander's eyes. Many advisors urged the young king to consolidate his position in Macedonia first, to spend time building his strength before attempting to deal with the Greek rebels. But Alexander understood something crucial. In politics, as in warfare, momentum was everything. If he appeared weak now, if he allowed the rebellion to spread unchecked, it would only grow stronger and more confident. So Alexander made a decision that stunned both his supporters and his enemies. Instead of waiting and preparing, he would march south immediately with the full power of Macedonia behind him. Within just 2 weeks of Philip's assassination, Alexander was leading an army toward the rebellious Greek cities, moving so quickly that many of his enemies barely had time to prepare their defenses. His first stop was at Thessaly, where local leaders had declared their independence from Macedonia. But when Alexander's army appeared on their borders, moving with the kind of speed and precision that had made Philip's forces legendary, the Thessalians quickly reconsidered their position. Without a single battle being fought, they submitted to Alexander's authority and pledged their continued loyalty. This pattern repeated itself across northern Greece. Cities that had been preparing for war suddenly found themselves face-to-face with a Macedonian army led by a king who clearly inherited his father's tactical genius. One by one, they submitted rather than face the devastating consequences of resistance. But the real test came when Alexander reached central Greece and the city of Thebes. This wasn't just any city. Thebes had been one of the great powers of Greece, the place where Philip himself had learned many of his most important lessons about warfare and politics. The Thebans had a proud military tradition and weren't about to submit without a fight. The siege of Thebes became Alexander's first great military victory as king. Using the siege techniques his father had perfected, combined with the revolutionary tactics of the Macedonian phalanx, Alexander's forces surrounded the city and began a systematic assault on its defenses. But what made this campaign truly remarkable wasn't just the military aspects. It was how Alexander used the siege as a message to the entire Greek world. When Thebes finally fell after a brief but intense siege, Alexander made a decision that shocked the ancient world. Instead of simply accepting the city's surrender and installing a friendly government, he ordered Thebes to be completely destroyed. Every building was torn down, every citizen was either killed or sold into slavery, and the once great city was wiped from the map entirely. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake, it was calculated political theater. Alexander understood that sometimes the most effective way to prevent future rebellions was to demonstrate the consequences of resistance so dramatically that no one would dare challenge his authority again. The destruction of Thebes sent a clear message to every other Greek city: submit peacefully, or share Thebes' fate. The psychological impact was immediate and overwhelming. Athens, which had been preparing for war, immediately sent ambassadors to negotiate their surrender. Sparta, the legendary military city-state, decided that discretion was the better part of valor and agreed to recognize Alexander's authority. Across Greece, cities that had been planning rebellion suddenly decided that Macedonian rule wasn't so bad after all. In less than 2 years, Alexander had not only secured his position as king of Macedonia, but had restored and strengthened his father's control over Greece. What had seemed like an impossible challenge for a 20-year-old had been accomplished through a combination of military brilliance, political cunning, and sheer audacity that left even his enemies impressed. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Alexander's early reign was how he managed to inspire absolute loyalty among his soldiers. These were men who had followed Philip for years, veterans who had witnessed the transformation of Macedonia from a broken kingdom into a military superpower. They could have easily dismissed Alexander as an inexperienced youth, but instead they followed him with a devotion that bordered on worship. Part of this loyalty came from Alexander's personal courage. Unlike many kings who commanded from safe positions behind their armies, Alexander always led from the front, sharing the dangers and hardships of his men. But there was something more, a quality that his contemporaries struggled to define, but that made soldiers believe they were following someone truly extraordinary. Some called it charisma, others spoke of divine favor, but what Alexander possessed was an absolute certainty in his own destiny. He didn't just believe he would succeed, he knew it with such complete confidence that his certainty became contagious. When Alexander told his men they would conquer the Persian Empire, they believed him not because the task seemed easy, but because Alexander's faith in success was so powerful it overwhelmed all doubts. With Greece firmly under his control and his position as king secure, Alexander could finally turn his attention to the dream that had consumed his father's final years. The Persian Empire, the greatest power in the known world, lay across the narrow strait that separated Europe from Asia. It was a realm so vast that it stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to the borders of India, ruled by kings who called themselves the equals of gods. Any reasonable person would have spent years preparing for such a monumental undertaking. But Alexander wasn't interested in being reasonable. He was ready to attempt something that would either make him the greatest conqueror in history or destroy him completely. The choice, as always with Alexander, was between glory and nothing at all. In the spring of 334 before Christ, Alexander stood on the shores of the Hellespont, the narrow strait that separated Europe from Asia, and made a decision that would echo through history. Behind him lay the familiar world of Greece and Macedonia, where his authority was now unquestioned. Ahead stretched the vast Persian Empire, a realm so enormous that no single person had ever seen all of it, ruled by kings who commanded resources that dwarfed anything the Greek world had ever imagined. The numbers alone should have given Alexander pause. His entire army consisted of roughly 40,000 men, a significant force by Greek standards, but barely a fraction of what the Persian Empire could field. The Persian king, Darius III, could call upon millions of subjects from dozens of different nations, each contributing their own specialized warriors and unique fighting techniques. Yet Alexander wasn't intimidated by these overwhelming odds. If anything, he seemed energized by the challenge. Throughout his life, he had been drawn to the impossible. And this was the most impossible task imaginable, conquering an empire that had dominated the ancient world for over 2 centuries, with a force small enough that he could personally know many of his soldiers by name. Before crossing into Asia, Alexander performed a ritual that revealed something profound about how he saw himself and his mission. He sailed to the ancient city of Troy, where, according to legend, the great hero Achilles had fought and died during the famous siege described by the poet Homer. There, at Achilles' supposed tomb, Alexander made sacrifices and declared himself the spiritual heir of the legendary warrior. This wasn't just theatrical showmanship, though Alexander certainly understood the power of symbols. He genuinely believed that he was destined for greatness on a scale that would surpass even the heroes of legend. More importantly, his soldiers believed it too, and that shared faith would prove more valuable than any weapon or tactical advantage. The crossing itself was deliberately symbolic. When Alexander's ship reached the Asian shore, he was the first to leap onto the beach, hurling his spear into the sand and declaring that he accepted Asia as a gift from the gods. His men cheered, but they also understood the deeper meaning. There would be no retreat, no return to the safety of Macedonia until their mission was complete. The first real test came almost immediately at a river called the Granicus. The Persian satraps, the regional governors who controlled Western Asia Minor, had assembled an army to stop Alexander before he could establish a foothold on their continent. These weren't the elite troops of the Persian heartland, but they were experienced fighters who knew their territory and had every advantage except one. They were facing Alexander. The Battle of Granicus became a perfect demonstration of how Alexander had refined his father's tactical innovations. The Macedonian phalanx, with their long sarissas, formed an unbreakable center, while Alexander himself led the companion cavalry in a charge that shattered the Persian line. But what made this victory truly remarkable wasn't just the tactics. It was Alexander's personal courage. In the thick of the fighting, Alexander found himself surrounded by enemy soldiers, his life hanging by a thread. It was here that his famous horse, Bucephalus, proved his worth. This wasn't just any war horse. Bucephalus was a massive black stallion that Alexander had tamed as a boy, a mount so intelligent and fierce that it seemed almost supernatural on the battlefield. Together, Alexander and Bucephalus fought their way through the Persian ranks with such devastating effectiveness that enemy soldiers began to flee rather than face them. The sight of the young Macedonian king, mounted on his legendary horse, cutting through their lines like a force of nature, broke the Persian army's will to fight. Word of this partnership between king and horse spread throughout the Persian Empire, taking on almost mythical proportions. Persian mothers would frighten their children with stories of the demon horse and its rider. More practically, Darius III became so concerned about the psychological impact of Bucephalus that he offered a bounty of 1,000 talents of gold, an absolutely enormous sum, for the horse's capture. The fact that the Persian king was willing to pay a fortune just to remove Alexander's horse from the battlefield shows how powerful symbols could be in ancient warfare. The victory at Granicus opened all of Western Asia Minor to Alexander's forces, but it also revealed something crucial about his strategy. Unlike many conquerors who simply destroyed everything in their path, Alexander was remarkably sophisticated in how he dealt with conquered territories. He understood that the Persian Empire was too vast to rule through fear alone. He needed to win the loyalty of the people he conquered. So Alexander began implementing a policy that shocked both his own men and his enemies. Instead of replacing Persian administrators with Macedonians, he often kept capable Persian officials in their positions, asking only that they serve him with the same loyalty they had shown Darius. This wasn't weakness or naivety. It was brilliant strategic thinking that allowed him to govern territories far too large for his small army to control through force alone. But the real test of Alexander's abilities came 2 years later, at a place called Issus. By then, Darius III had realized that this wasn't just another border raid that could be handled by regional governors. The great king himself took the field, leading an army that contemporary sources claim numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The Battle of Issus became one of the most famous encounters in ancient history, not just because of its scale, but because of what it revealed about both Alexander and Darius. The Persian king had chosen his battlefield carefully, selecting a narrow coastal plain where Alexander's tactical advantages would be minimized and Persian numbers could tell. But Alexander turned even this disadvantage into an opportunity. The narrow battlefield meant that most of the Persian army couldn't engage effectively, neutralizing their numerical superiority. More importantly, Alexander identified where Darius himself was positioned and led a direct cavalry charge straight at the Persian king's position. What happened next changed the course of world history. As Alexander and his companions thundered toward him, Darius lost his nerve and fled the battlefield, abandoning his army and even his own family to Alexander's mercy. The sight of their king fleeing broke the Persian army completely, turning what should have been a hard-fought battle into a complete rout. The psychological impact of Darius's flight was devastating for Persian morale throughout the empire. If the great king himself, the supposed equal of the gods, couldn't stand against this young Macedonian, what hope did anyone else have? But Alexander's treatment of Darius's captured family revealed another dimension of his character. Instead of treating them as prisoners or using them as hostages, he showed them the respect due to royalty, ensuring they were cared for with dignity and honor. This combination of military brilliance and political wisdom reached its climax at Gaugamela, where Darius made his final stand. The Persian king had chosen a vast plain where his superior numbers and cavalry could operate freely, and he had even leveled the ground to make it perfect for his scythed chariots, weapons designed to tear apart infantry formations. On paper, this should have been the end of Alexander's adventure. Darius had assembled the largest army in ancient history, drawing troops from across his vast empire. Against this massive host, Alexander's 40,000 men seemed laughably inadequate, but Alexander had spent his entire life preparing for exactly this kind of challenge. His tactical plan at Gaugamela was so sophisticated that military historians still study it today. While his phalanx held the center against overwhelming odds, Alexander led his cavalry in a series of precisely timed maneuvers that gradually pulled the Persian army out of formation. The climax came when Alexander, once again mounted on Bucephalus, led a final charge directly at Darius's position. For the second time, the Persian king chose flight over fight, and his retreat triggered the collapse of the entire Persian army. In a single day, an empire that had ruled the known world for 2 centuries was effectively destroyed. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Alexander's conquest wasn't the battles themselves. It was how he managed to hold together such a diverse army through years of constant campaigning in hostile territory. His soldiers came from many different backgrounds and cultures, yet they followed him with unwavering loyalty across thousands of miles of unfamiliar terrain. Part of this loyalty came from Alexander's willingness to share their hardships. He ate the same food, slept on the same ground, and faced the same dangers as his men. But there was something more, a sense that they were part of something greater than themselves, that they were witnessing history being made by someone truly extraordinary. With 3 decisive victories, Alexander had accomplished the impossible. The Persian Empire, which had seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves, was his. But conquering was only the beginning. Now came the even greater challenge of ruling an empire larger than anyone had ever imagined possible. When we look back at the incredible story of Macedonia's rise from a fractured kingdom to the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen, it's hard to believe it all happened in the span of just 1 generation. Philip II spent 23 years transforming his homeland from a collection of feuding nobles into a military superpower that could challenge the greatest civilizations of its time. His son Alexander then took that carefully crafted weapon and in just 13 years used it to conquer more territory than any human being before or since. But this isn't just a story about military conquest or political ambition. At its heart, it's a story about vision and the incredible things that can happen when someone truly believes in the impossible. Philip saw potential where others saw only chaos, creating order from the fractured kingdom he inherited. Alexander saw opportunity where others saw insurmountable obstacles, turning his father's achievements into the foundation for something even greater. The partnership between these two remarkable men was one of the most effective collaborations in human history, even though they rarely fought side by side after Cheronea. Philip built the tools and systems that made conquest possible, while Alexander provided the vision and audacity to use those tools on a scale that defied all conventional wisdom. Neither could have achieved what they did without the other's contributions. Consider the sheer magnitude of what Alexander accomplished. In an age when communication traveled only as fast as the fastest horse, he managed to hold together an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to the borders of India. His kingdom encompassed dozens of different cultures, languages, and traditions, yet somehow he found ways to govern this vast diversity without losing control or fragmenting into competing factions. What made this even more remarkable was Alexander's age when he died. At 32, he was younger than most people are when they're just beginning to find their place in the world, yet he had already reshaped the entire known world. The empire he created was larger than Rome would ever be, even at the height of its power centuries later. It covered more territory than any single person had ever ruled, and it did so with a level of cultural sophistication that influenced civilization for generations to come. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Alexander's legacy isn't what he conquered, but how he chose to rule what he had won. Unlike many conquerors who simply imposed their own culture on defeated peoples, Alexander actively sought to blend the best elements of different civilizations. He married Persian nobility, adopted certain Eastern customs, and encouraged his soldiers to do the same. This wasn't just political calculation. It reflected a genuinely cosmopolitan vision of what an empire could be. The cities Alexander founded during his conquests became centers of learning and culture that outlasted his empire by centuries. Alexandria in Egypt became home to the greatest library and museum of the ancient world, attracting scholars and philosophers from across the known world. Dozens of other cities bearing his name served as bridges between Eastern and Western civilizations, facilitating trade and cultural exchange that enriched both sides. Yet for all his unprecedented achievements, Alexander supposedly died with a sense of incompleteness that speaks to something fundamental about human ambition. According to the historian Plutarch, when Alexander was asked who should inherit his empire, his final words were, "To the strongest." But more poignantly, he was said to have wept because there were no more worlds to conquer. Whether this famous quote is historically accurate or not, it captures something essential about Alexander's character. He wasn't driven by wealth or comfort or even power in the conventional sense. He was driven by the need to test the limits of what was possible, to push beyond every boundary and see what lay on the other side. In that sense, his regret wasn't really about lacking more territories to conquer. It was about reaching the edge of the known world and wondering what mysteries might lie beyond. The influence of Philip and Alexander on subsequent history is almost impossible to measure. The Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from Alexander's empire carried Greek culture and ideas across vast distances, creating a shared intellectual heritage that influenced everything from art and architecture to philosophy and science. The Romans, who would eventually dominate the Mediterranean world, were profoundly influenced by Greek culture and Macedonian military techniques. But perhaps their most important legacy was proving that extraordinary things are possible when vision meets determination. Philip showed that even the most entrenched systems can be revolutionized by someone willing to think differently and work systematically toward their goals. Alexander demonstrated that with the right preparation and absolute confidence in one's mission, even the most impossible dreams can become reality. Their story also reminds us that individual leadership can have profound consequences for entire civilizations. Without Philip's military innovations and state-building genius, Macedonia would have remained a minor kingdom on the periphery of the Greek world. Without Alexander's vision and audacity, those innovations might never have been tested on the grand scale that changed world history. Yet their achievements also came with costs that we shouldn't ignore. The wars they fought, while relatively restrained by ancient standards, still involved enormous human suffering. The empires they built, despite their cultural achievements, were still based on conquest and the subjugation of other peoples. Their legacy is complex, combining genuine contributions to human civilization with the harsh realities of ancient warfare and imperial rule. What makes their story enduringly fascinating isn't just the scale of their achievements, but the human dimensions of their characters. Philip, the former hostage who used his painful experiences to forge revolutionary insights. Alexander, the young man who combined tactical genius with a romantic vision of his own destiny. Both were flawed human beings who nonetheless accomplished things that seemed impossible to their contemporaries and continue to amaze us today. In the end, the story of Macedonia's rise teaches us something important about the relationship between preparation and opportunity. Philip's patient work in building Macedonia's military and political strength created the foundation that made Alexander's spectacular conquests possible. But it took Alexander's unique combination of ambition and confidence to recognize and seize the opportunities that his father's preparations had created. Their partnership across the generations reminds us that the greatest achievements often build on previous work, that today's breakthroughs become tomorrow's launching points for even greater accomplishments. In that sense, the legacy of Philip and Alexander isn't just about ancient history. It's about the ongoing human story of vision, preparation, and the courage to attempt the impossible. What lessons can we draw from this ancient tradition? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires for more untold stories of the ancient world.